Okay, great. So we return to our third session of the topic of Olam Haba and of the afterlife. And as we've been discussing, this is one of the biggest topics that has captured the minds, imaginations, and souls of people for the last thousands of years. The philosophers, the theologians, and now even the scientists in a very significant way. One of the most profound questions: what will be for us? What will be, and for who? For whom will this reality be for our eternity? We saw this profound idea in Nietzsche that ultimately this notion of the eternal currents suggests that each moment of our existence we are free to radically choose our own existence, and that one notion, as he did a sort of a thought experiment of the next world, is that we were to relive perpetually, over and over again, this life. If we were to, over and over again, without the freedom, re-experience this life, would that be a heaven or hell? And he says that that is the thought experiment that the notion of an afterlife should provide for us. The question of not what will be, but how am I living every moment now? And would I reaffirm each moment as how I live it now if I had to live that moment again for eternity? So that's sort of a radical way of suggesting what we've already said is the major Jewish approach, which is that that the main point of the afterlife is not what will be, but what it inspires us to do in this world. And that's what Nietzsche sort of suggests in one way or another. I want to say some broad comments before we look at some texts about a couple major notions of the afterlife in Jewish thought. Firstly, and the most popular one we all learned when we were 4 years old, is the notion of schar va'onesh, the notion of punishment and reward. The sense that if you do good, you're rewarded. If you do bad, you're punished. We see it in the Gemara in Sanhedrin. It talks about the tsara de kavra, that the pains of the grave, that ultimately the notion of punishment is that one encounters this tsara de kavra, these pains of the grave, but also some imagination of what a next life would look like as a heaven. And there's a number of texts we're going to look at tonight that explain that. That this notion of reward called Olam Haba, or in other cases called Olam HaChaim, the world of life, and what that ultimately looks like. And I want to just reiterate that the primary Jewish approach, even though we saw a couple sources that said otherwise, is that the Olam Haba is not determined based on any dogma. Judaism is not about believing in X, Y, and Z. It's about actions. Right? The primary measurement that seems to be used throughout the rabbinic literature is not that one must believe X, Y, and Z. To be sure, there are fundamental theological beliefs in Judaism, of course, but those aren't sort of the ticket of entryway as much as actions. And those actions traditionally have not just been about moral behavior, although that's certainly the essence, but also in the literature, not only the Ben Adam l'Chaveiro, the relationship to one's fellow human, but Ben Adam l'Makom, one's relationship to God, and that's sort of understood through the context of mitzvot, or ritual observance. And this combination of moral behavior and ritual observance is considered to be the actions that one is ultimately judged upon, based upon traditional Jewish sources. So that's one basic model, schar va'onesh, reward and punishment. You do good, you get rewarded. You do bad, you get punished. And Judaism embraces this heaven and hell, and an in-between, which we'll talk more about. The second is this mystical approach, which we talked a bit about already, where this notion that the soul returns to the source, that we are ultimately a part of God, and in a sort of natural / mystical kind of way, that less of a judgment, but things naturally return to where their sources were, what their source was. That everything has an essence, and that essence goes back to its place. The process philosophers, not that anyone should have or needs to have heard of a process philosopher, are those who embraced pantheism. Now, pantheism is the notion that everything is God, right? But panentheism is the notion that everything is God, but there is still a separate creator of everything that is not God, the essence. And so Judaism rejects pantheism, the notion that there is no creator, merely everything is God, but embraces, in mystical side, not the rational side, panentheism, which claims that everything is, everyone is a part of God, but that there still is a separation, there still is a creator and a controller of that process. So that's number two. This notion that there is objective mortality, that is, physical bodies die, but subjective immortality, which is to say that the world of experience continues and has an immortal component to it. And so the first model is schar va'onesh, reward and punishment. The second is a mystical return to the source, less of a judgment model and more of a natural sort of flow of souls. But the third, which is really important, I want to emphasize, is the Rambam, Maimonides. And Maimonides suggests something very interesting, which is that that when the body dies, the soul continues. And the soul continues to the extent of its own grandeur. That is to say that if one never cultivated a soul, meaning we eat, we drink, we sleep, we do all this stuff, right? But maybe we even cultivate the intellect. But the soul is never cultivated. He would simply say, there's no reward or punishment. Simply, there was no soul, there was no eternal component to you left to exist. Your body died, you died. Right? If someone cultivated a soul, which is naturally, metaphysically, an outside of body or a type of existence, then when the body dies, naturally, that soul continues to the extent it's cultivated. So the Rambam would suggest, and this is a really important notion of Jewish theology, that it's not just about reward and punishment, it's about what soul you created. If you created this beautiful soul, then that continues through eternity, because it's not a physical thing. It exists in the heavens right now, so to speak, just as it would then, and even more so once it's removed from the physical barriers. But if one didn't cultivate that, nothing would exist. And in our conversations next week, those who come, I want to flesh that notion out more. Fourthly, and this is something I promised I would talk about, so I want to now, is the notion of Gilgulim. Who knows what Gilgulim is? Gilgulim, yeah.
The rolling of the souls.
The rolling of the souls, which means reincarnation. So Gilgulim is the Jewish notion of reincarnation. For those who find it troubling to embrace a notion that those who fail in this short life are going to be eternally damned, or for those who have trouble with the notion that the righteous have the same destiny as the wicked, Gilgulim offers another alternative. And that alternative is like this. The reincarnation belief, as we understand it, is that the neshama, the human soul, returns to the earth in a new body after death and after the separation from a previous body. There's three primary approaches that the Jewish theologians take to this. To be sure, some totally reject it. And when it comes to eschatology, next world stuff, the rabbis really, use fighting words with each other. Because the rationalists and the mystics, and they were usually totally different cities and camps, really didn't like each other so much. People like the Rambam and the Ramban, Nachmanides and Maimonides. And then there's Gersonides, who's a hyper-rationalist. So, all of these characters, they had a certain respect for each other's scholarship, but a disdain for notions they felt were totally off the mark. So the rationalists would have hated this idea of reincarnation, but the mystics pretty much embrace it. So one approach. There was someone named Rav Sagi Nahor. Rav Sagi Nahor is generally believed to be the author of Sefer HaBahir, a famous work. He was 12th century southern France. And Rav Sagi Nahor argues that transmigration, or reincarnation, the re-embodiment of souls, offers the most compelling response to the problems of theodicy. As you recall, the notion of theodicy, or the questions of theodicy, are why do the good suffer and why do the wicked prosper, right? And he says that reincarnation is an answer to that, right? Nobody's ever heard a perfect answer, right? But he says it is an answer. Why? Because, the Bahir answers, a righteous individual suffers in this world as the result of the wrongs that he or she did in a past life. And the soul of the righteous person is in fact not entirely virtuous at all. It too has a history. And so he says, he doesn't say it like this, but don't get too worked up about why the wicked are prospering and why the righteous are suffering in this world. There is a logic to it, and it's not just, they'll get it in the next world. It's that they are a part of a long stream or strand of existence in multiple souls. And he believes this answers that philosophical problem, ultimately. So that's one approach to why reincarnation is embraced according to the Behir. The second approach, embraced by the Ramban, Nachmanides, and Rabbeinu Bechaya, they argue fiercely for transmigration, based on the principle that there are certain mitzvot, certain Jewish goods, that are not possible unless the notion of reincarnation exists. For example, anyone ever heard of Yibum? Yibum is this really crazy Torah idea that if a man dies and he has not yet had a child with his wife, then what happens? His brother must marry his wife. Right? That's Yibum. And if he doesn't want to do it, in fact, we don't really want him to do it, then he takes his shoe off and she spits in it. Okay, that's called chalitza. Okay, nobody ever said Jews weren't crazy, but we have these beautiful ideas. Anyways, what the Ramban and Rabbeinu Bechaya say is that why does he have to marry her? Because he needs to bring his brother's soul back into existence. And the child of that new marriage will be the reincarnation of that soul. And so they believe Yibum only makes sense in the context of reincarnation. And so that is one proactive mitzvah that the Torah gave us to proactively embrace reincarnation. That's the second idea. The third idea is given by Rav Chaim Vital in his work, his magnum opus called Shar HaGilgulim. And he argues there that the importance of transmigration is that it gives humans the potential to seek growth, perfection, and actualization. He argues that to fulfill the Taryag Mitzvot, the 613 commandments of the Torah, completely, and in order to achieve the ideal closeness to God and live the good life, we return to a new life over and over to attempt to fulfill that mission that we've been given in the world until our intellectual comprehension has mastered what it needs to master. And so his suggestion is, it's not merely a punishment to return back to the world, but each of us has to return completed, and nobody can get that right in one life. That we need multiple lives to complete our souls, and so we keep coming back to re-experience the world in order to achieve that. So to recap, the three primary arguments suggested for Gilgulim, reincarnation, are one, that it's a response to theodicy, why the good suffer and the evil and the wicked prosper. Second, it's a way to explain how certain mitzvot make sense that wouldn't normally make sense. And thirdly, it's an opportunity for spiritual and intellectual actualization that could not happen in merely one life. Now, to be sure, there are problems here as well. I'll name only three of them. Firstly, is it fair that a new body is going to suffer for the wrongs of a past body? Now, some of these questions might feel absurd because this is such a high-level, metaphysical way of thinking about existence. But is it fair that this new body has and is now a righteous person? They suffer for the past soul. That's one question to throw out, which I don't attempt to answer. Secondly, to what extent is the soul actually me? Right? If it's a different body, it's a different personality. There is no memory. To what extent is that new body with that soul that I have now actually me? So maybe on some grandiose spiritual plane, there is a soul existence which carries over to the new body. But without that memory, what makes that a value, right? Now, to be sure, there is a congregant here, and he's pretty open about it, although I won't say his name, who is confident that he knows all of his past lives. No, he's not crazy. He's actually a member of very good standing and a respected member of our community, and he'll talk frequently about his past lives in the community and who he believes he was, and he'll talk about wars he was in and places he existed in Eastern Europe as if it's clearly still a part of him. And he believes that part of our work is to tap into that and to access that. Some even suggest that a part of our dreams are a window into that reality. That we have experiences in our dreams which don't make any sense because we've never experienced it, and yet we have in a different context. Okay, so that's that. So again, four models I threw out just before we even got to the text. Firstly is reward and punishment. Secondly is this mystical approach, the return of the soul. Thirdly is the Rambam, that if you cultivated your soul, you continue to exist. If you didn't, there's nothing left. And fourthly, this notion of reincarnation. That that we return in different forms. And it's beyond the scope of tonight to talk about returning in animal form versus a human form. Interesting Hindu comparisons would be interesting, yes?
How do you cultivate your soul?
Okay, good. So how we cultivate the soul would be a whole nother series we could do, a 10-part series, which I'd love to do if there's anybody into it, on, how prayer, meditation, other things are used, not merely to, hey, I said the words, hey, I showed up at shul on Shabbos morning, do I get a star or something, But actually, to actually make sure the experiences we do cultivate the soul in a way that gives one that eternal existence. Again, I don't have the answers to that. I can merely channel some of the wisdom from the tradition. But I would love to talk about that. Actually, next week, if anyone wants to come, we could even tap into that. Okay, so I want to look at now our second source on this page we were just looking at with Nietzsche. And this is one of the most famous Gemaras, the Talmudic passages. Again, just when I say Gemara, in case anyone isn't aware, the Talmud has two sections. The first section is called the Mishnah. The second section is called the Gemara. And the Mishnah is about years 0 to 200, and the Gemara is about 200 to 500. And the Mishnah's job is to comment on the Torah. The Gemara's job is to comment on the Mishnah. Okay? So the Mishnah is not so much isn't so much dialectics, dialogical. It's not so much an argument back and forth. It's more of just interpretation. And the Gemara is all arguments. Actually, it's not all arguments. It's 3/4 arguments, and it's a quarter narrative, which is called Agadah. The 3/4 argument is called halakha, Jewish law, and Agadah is called Jewish narrative. Or Jewish narrative is called Agadah. And, okay, anyway, so here's a Gemara from Rosh Hashanah, the tractate of Rosh Hashanah. And this is a very important text. Here's what it says. It has been taught, Beit Shammai say, there will be 3 groups at the day of judgment. One of thoroughly righteous people, the Sadiqim Gamurim. There's papers on that table there. Sadiqim Gamurim. One of thoroughly wicked, the Rashayim Gamurim. And one intermediate, the Beinoni. Okay, 3 categories: righteous, wicked, and the middle people, the common people. The thoroughly righteous will forthwith be inscribed definitively as entitled to everlasting life. The Hebrew there is l'chaye olam. L'chaye olam, this everlasting life. So immediately upon death, according to this text, the righteous go to this heaven. The thoroughly wicked will forthwith be inscribed definitively as doomed to Gehenna, doomed to this hell, as it says, and many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life and some to reproaches and everlasting abhorrence. That's from Daniel, the book of Daniel. The intermediate, the Beinonim, will go down to Gehenna and squeal and rise again. Now what's that called in English? Purgatory. Purgatory is the temporary place where one is purified in order to then go to the heaven. So Rabbi Akiva, the great Rabbi Akiva, argues this is 12 months long. Again, that's why Kaddish is 11 months out of the 12-month period. But it's interesting. Rav Yochanan ben Nuri says purgatory is only 49 days. Now 49 days is interesting for a lot of reasons. One is because it's when we count the Omer, we're counting different levels of ascending spiritually, or descending. And anyway, so part of that is about the 49 days of purity to ascend back up. So this notion of purgatory is a Jewish idea. As it says, and I will bring the third part through the fire, and will refine them as silver is refined, and will try them as gold is tried. They shall call on my name, and I will answer them, from Zechariah. Of them too, Hannah said, from the book of Shmuel, we learn prayer from Hannah, the Lord killeth and maketh alive, bringeth down to the grave and bringeth up, from the book of Samuel. And so we see here from this Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, and this is quoted often around high holidays, this idea that there are 3 categories of people, the righteous, the wicked, and the middle people. And even the middle people, those who don't live excellent lives, but they try their best. They try their best. They're not wicked people. They too will have a place in heaven, but there's a purification process involved with that. So this suggests that the heavens are not merely for the elite, but the immediate access is. and that the eternal punishment is only for the truly wicked, not those who stumble a bunch of times like every other human has. Okay, so the next question I want to ask is, what is Sheol? Sheol is one of the words that's used throughout the Tanakh to refer to some place. And I bring a couple commentaries on this idea. Firstly, from the Radak. The Radak is Rav David Kimchi from the 12th and 13th century of Provence. And he says, "The Lord, you took me from Sheol, revived me from the descent into the pit." Sheol and pit mean Gehenna. Again, that means hell, which is the judgment place of the wicked. So he argues, Rav David Kimchi argues, that Sheol is the same thing as Gehenna. There is no difference. Okay? So the Recanati, who's a 13th century Italian thinker, comments on this verse in Vayikra and says, "It's written, as a cloud fades away, so whoever goes down to Sheol does not come up." This is from Iyov, from the book of Job. We're going to come back to this in a minute. But it is also written, "From the belly of Sheol I cried out." Remember, in the book of Job, it says, from the belly of Sheol I cried out, and you heard my voice. And the Lord deals death and gives life, cast down into Sheol and raises up. Rather, this is Sheol and the other is the depths. And we establish it this way, that from one can return and from one cannot return. So here we see that Sheol is not like the Tachtit, like the depths. Sheol is like a purgatory, where one can rise up. And the Tachtit is more like Gehenna, is more like this hell. Actually, it's not totally correct to say Sheol here is like a purgatory. Rather that it is a... so good. Here's a second category. One is that each individual has this year-long period in this... The intermediary type person has this year-long place in purgatory. The other notion is that people, if you recall from last time, are held in a holding place until Yemei Mashiach, until the days of the Messiah. And then all those cells that are in a holding place then are sort of liberated into another existence. So here we see Sheol, whether in one of those two categories, is a temporary place. And this sort of reminds us of Dante's Inferno once again. This notion that there is these different levels of depths, right? There is Sheol, there's Gehenna, and then there's this Tachtit, like the real depths. And that there's these different layers based upon who one is. Now skip the next source for a moment and go to the Baba Batra Talmudic passage, right below it. Which deals with the same phrase. It says, "As the cloud is consumed and vanishes away, so he that goes down to Sheol shall come up no more." Rava said, this shows that Job denied the resurrection of the dead. And he denies the resurrection of the dead, and because of how he interprets the word, I guess they're saying in the book, which is sort of a difficult to understand. Now, just to put it in context, this is about 1,000 years. This is about 1,000 years before Recanati, who's bringing the same idea. So Recanati is probably learning from here this notion that Sheol is not the end place; it's a temporary place. And Job is either punished because he didn't embrace this belief of resurrection of the dead, or more likely he doesn't believe in it, so he can't attain it. Again, going back to what does it mean to cultivate the soul? Part of it means sort of the suspension of disbelief, where one can truly embrace certain spiritual realities wholeheartedly and sort of exist within them, rather than being intellectual ideas. Oh, there's this heaven, there's this hell, there is a God, there is a soul. To actually sort of exist in that experiential realm, and if one can experience it to some degree, then one can access it eternally. Now, one of the ideas given here is that Shabbos is called Me'ein Olam Haba. Anyone ever heard that? There's songs we sing about this. Shabbos Me'ein Olam Haba. That Shabbat is a taste of the world to come. 1/60th of a taste of the world to come. And so one of the ways it's explained is that if one truly embraces the Shabbat experience, then one embraces 1/60th of this experience of a heaven, so to speak. One explanation of Shabbat is that we pretend on Shabbat like the world is perfect. Right? 6 days we acknowledge the world is totally broken and we work to fix it. One day we pretend like it's actually perfect, and through that pretending, we access a little bit of that sense of a perfect world to a certain degree. And we can return to a broken world refreshed. in a way that we are inspired to encounter in our new world. So part of this notion here is that Shabbat is one of those access points. Now, if you go to the text just above it, this is sort of an interesting rabbinic imagination about the spatial existence of the world. And this, again, is not meant literally, I think. The world is a 60th a part of Gan Eden, of the Garden of Eden. And the Garden of Eden is a 60th a part of Gehenna, this hell. Consequently, the whole world is in comparison to like the lid of a pot. Some declare that the Garden of Eden, Gan Eden, is limitless in extent, and others say this the same of Gehenna, of the hell. Now, what do you think they're arguing about here? You going to say something? You about to say something? No. Okay. Then I think part of what they're talking about here is, where are most people? Right? That might be one way to think of this text. Is the hell bigger or is the heaven bigger? It might mean, is the experiential realm more sort of encapsulating? But more likely they're saying, where are most? And the main position here is that Gehenna is sold out. Right? that there's this realm of hell. And you ever ask the question, are people more good or evil? Do most people at the end of their lives, do they take more from the world or do they give more to the world? Right? Is the existence, is there more suffering or is there more mercy? Is there more joy or more pain? And ultimately they're saying, look, this Garden of Eden is much larger than this world in any way we can understand. But the hell is a lot bigger than that too. And again, this is metaphorical. It's trying to inspire certain intellectual ideas. What's it?
Yeah, for Shabbat.
And part of this is about Shabbat as well. This notion that Shabbat is 1/60th, right, of that world to come, and that's how we access it. Okay. Now, to totally shift gears a little bit, I want to look at the question of can we access that soul a little bit, but also, do those souls ever visit here? Right? We've all perhaps thought about that, especially if one has lost somebody and wants to communicate with them. And I'm not going to go too deep into this, but I want to just touch on it. First, I want to look at Rav Aaron Soloveitchik. He was the brother of what people called the Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, the great team. Their third brother actually isn't talked so much about. He was a quiet chemist at Yeshiva University, and he would eat lunch alone. And occasionally, some people would come to talk to him. But the two brothers, there were lines to talk to them, and the third brother was kind of quiet. Actually, I'm gonna bracket that joke because it would. I'll tell you after. Okay, so here's what he says. He gets sick and he's in a hospital, and here's what he wrote in his book, "Logic of the Heart, Logic of the Mind," which I recommend. The fact that I am now constantly under the impact of a biological sensation of carrying a foreign, detached object consisting of the left side of my body corroborates the proposition that the human soul is a separate entity having an identity of its own and extraneous to the body. In a normal person, the body and soul are synthesized and integrated in such a beautiful and well-integrated pattern that for all practical purposes, the soul appears to be immanent in the body. Now, this is one of the great rabbis of the 20th century, and it took him to get sick in his elder years to finally truly understand the existence of his soul. Once his body was basically in paralysis, and his mind was basically checked out in a different way, he began to access that he was more than his body, and he was more than his mind, and he finally came to truly understand the existence of something that was post-body, that was outside of the body. And unfortunately, in my personal pastoral experience, a lot of people don't have this experience until the end of life, where it's at the end of life, one begins to sort of be in this in-between zone on a spiritual level of starting to access the spiritual realm outside of their body realm. Their body is basically dead or in the last minutes, and they begin to access this sort of spiritual realm for themselves. And that's a really powerful thing to experience and to watch, especially as family, or as somebody who's saying the final confession with these individuals. And so, ideally, I think part of what the tradition is trying to get us to do is to not wait for that end-of-life experience to tap into that reality, or at least to attempt to see if there's something there that we can grab a hold of. Now, looking at this question of, do those who have died visit this world? There's many sources on this. I only bring three to basically affirm, to some degree, that there is some possibility of the visitation of souls. Now the first text says from Shabbat, be fervent in my funeral eulogy, for I will be standing there. This is what one of the rabbis says to another rabbi. Imagine, I have to give another eulogy on Sunday, unfortunately, for a very special person. But the idea of somebody saying to me before, be careful in this eulogy because I'm going to be right there, listening as well. But here we see through this story in the Talmud this belief that the spiritual presence of an individual exists in this world after the physical presence ends. After their physical existence ends. And part of the idea of Jewish law that we should bury a person as quick as possible, that is to reject the other two ends. One rejection is cremation, meaning the speeding up of burial, and the other end is rejecting embalmment, like mummification, the extension of the preservation of the body. And that's why it's so troubling in the Parsha this Shabbos that we see Yaakov and Yosef and the notion of embalmment that happens in the Bible. That there is an embalmment that happens. This is partly from the Egyptian influence. But Jewish law says we don't speed up or slow down burial, and so you put the body directly into the earth, or into a box that will ultimately dissolve in the earth. And part of that is because the soul hangs here until the body is buried. And to give comfort to that soul, we got to get the body buried as quick as possible. Now, of course, in Jewish law, there are some heterim, some permissions. Sometimes a family member can't get there right away, this and that, so we try to navigate that. But generally, we try to get them in there as quick as possible. Over there in Bava Batra, it says the dead communicate with human realms and with the heavenly realms. In Bava Batra, 2 different Gemaras I found. So there is a sense that there is communication, even if it's embraced. And lastly, in Genesis Rabbah, in this midrash, Bar Kapara taught until 3 days after death, the soul keeps returning to the grave, thinking that it will go back into the body. But when it sees that the facial features have become disfigured, it departs and abandons it. It abandons the body. This is actually the only precedent I know for a value to anything short of a shiva. Generally we say, according to Jewish law, we're concerned with shiva, 7 days from the burial onwards. But here we see a special status to the first 3 days of Shiva. And actually, I've heard in this community, some people embrace this first 3 days as more significant than the full 7 to some degree. And here we see that there's some sense that the soul, whether there's been burial or not, actually, no, it's actually talking from burial. I put in brackets here after death, but actually upon reflection, I think it's actually doing with burial. Because there's already an assumption that prior to burial, the soul is definitely in this world. In a sense. Okay, so that's the first bit around presence in this world. I want to look at a couple texts that try to describe what heaven is, and they don't do a wonderful job. I certainly would do no better, but it's certainly not a clear picture in a lot of ways. The first text is from Ta'anit, from the tractate of the fast days, and it says here. We're on the second sheet now. You all see where? Yeah. Cool. Okay. In Olam Haba, in the world to come, the Blessed One will arrange, I love this idea, a dance. There will be a dance for the righteous in Gan Eden, in the Garden of Eden. He's sitting in their midst, and each one will point to him. Again, the gendered language isn't so helpful. God is not a man, of course. With his fingers, exclaiming, "Lo, this is our God, and we have waited for him, and he will save us. This is the Lord, we have waited for him. We'll be glad and rejoice in his salvation." Now, the Hasidim, the Hasidim, they really run with this idea, this notion that the next world is a dance party, and those who are righteous are in the center of the dance, and those who weren't are very far. If you've ever tried to get to the center of a dance and you're pushed out to the walls, you know it's not the most fun experience. Or if you're on the balconies watching, that would be a different experience as well. But that the righteous are in the center of this dance. And actually the Breslovers deal, the Hasidic sect of Breslov embrace this idea that there's an egalitarian nature to it. That there is sort of a circle that there's different rings of circles of people holding hands, dancing around divinity. Rather than this other description we saw of people sitting at a table learning, hearing like a class, and whether, again, that's heaven or hell, to be engaged in Torah all day for existence, for eternity. This notion that there's a dance, and there's people dancing in different spheres, kind of like Simchas Torah in a sense, right? Simchat Torah, that people are dancing based upon how close to the radiance, based upon what their soul was. Our second idea from Numbers Rabbah, from this midrash, is that in Olam Haba, the Blessed One will prepare a banquet for the righteous. So those who prefer food at parties rather than the dancing, this is a little more appealing. A banquet for the righteous in Gan Eden, of Garden of Eden, and there will be no need to provide balsam or perfumes, because a north wind and a south wind will sweep through the sprinkle all the romantic plants of Gan Eden, so that they will yield their fragrance. And so here we see this very sensual idea of a paradise. That there's this party of sort of food and smell and fragrance, and there's very much a body experience, a corporeal reality. I'm tempted to read this next source, but I think I'm not going to, because it's a little bit long, and I'll leave it to you for later. But it's another description from this midrash of Yalkut Shimoni. I think that's an R there, but it should be an M, I'm sorry. It says Shir Noni, but it's really Yalkut Shimoni at the bottom there. And here they deal with that each person has their own chamber, like their own room allotted to them, according to their honor. So as opposed to there being this collective dance party or this collective banquet, this is a notion of sort of a more isolated type of spiritual existence rather than a collective one. Okay. Now, going back to resurrection, I'm not going to get back into this point, but I just wanted to bring this source on the bottom of the sheet. It says, from this Gemara of Ta'anit, of the fast days, which deals with the questions of theodicy, again, good and evil, the notion that we fast as part of our attempt to bring bounty down is dealt with. And it says, more important is a day of rain than the resurrection of the dead, since the resurrection is for the righteous and not the wicked, whereas rain is both for the righteous and the wicked. Right? Rain is one of the most egalitarian of human experiences. Nobody can dodge the rain. Prior to the advent of the great umbrella, nobody could dodge the rain. But ultimately, the good and evil experience the rain together. And the rain here is a metaphor for physical bounty, that we know plenty of wealthy people who are really kind of terrible people, and we know many poor people who are really righteous souls. But ultimately, that the rain, that the bounty, the money or wealth in this world, impacts both the righteous and the wicked. But the resurrection, meaning after the Messianic era, as it's embraced, that when the souls sort of are resurrected, mechaye metim, right? The life is given to the dead once again. That only happens for the righteous. Now here it doesn't include what we saw in this other Gemara about the intermediary people. I would presume it's embracing that as well, but it's not explicit. Okay, a couple of Zohar passages I want to conclude the sources with tonight. The Zohar, again, is really the Bible of Jewish mysticism. According to the traditionalists, it's close to 2,000 years old. According to the academics, it's more like 700 or 800 years old. And that's based upon the dating of the type of Aramaic that's used. Some say it's a language used that's clearly within the last 1,000 years, and others say it's of the Talmudic era. We're not going to get into dating stuff. It's not so relevant. But the first thing we see here from the Tikkunei Zohar is embraces the idea of reincarnation. If there is even one organ in which the Holy Blessed One does not dwell, then he will be brought back into the world in a reincarnation because of this organ until he becomes perfected in his parts, that all of them may be perfect in the image of the Holy One, blessed be he. Which is to say that souls are put into this world, and God only wants them back when they don't, reduce, God's pristine quality, so to speak. And so we return back into this world again. And only at a certain point do they return. People heard of the Lamed Vav Nikim? The Lamed Vav Nikim was this idea that there's only 36 righteous people in the world. Nobody knows who they are, and they themselves don't know that they're the ones. At every given point in the world is sustained because of these Lamed Vavnikim, because of these 36 righteous people that exist. And generally they're considered to be humble, sort of out of the scene, sort of the old metaphor of like the Messiah on a donkey, or the old, Jewish European carpenter or shoemaker, the person who is really kind of this humble workforce in the background, but is doing chesed, kindness, all the time. So constantly giving to people in ways that nobody even knows or sees. That this is sort of this model of this Lamed Vavnik. And anyways, once one reaches that point, then that soul returns, and then someone else is reincarnated into that new stance of, it becomes that new Lamed Vavnik. Okay. This next source in the Zohar deals with the Tzror HaChayim, the bundle of the living. And we see here a notion, we're wrestling here with the question of, is there a body in the next world? And the Zohar has an interesting answer to that. Like most rabbinic answers, the answer is yes and no. And so it says, that holy celestial abode, which is called the bundle of the living, the Tzror HaChayim, where the holy superior grade called the super soul. There's a great poet of the last 200 years who wrote about the super soul. Anyone remember who that is? It's going to come to me in a minute. Thoreau. Thoreau talked about the oversoul, he called it. David Thoreau, he's not really a poet, he's a novelist or whatever you want to call it. Thoreau. Anyways, if you're interested, it's something to Google. The oversoul is just fascinating. Anyways, the super soul, the neshama, how do you pronounce this word? Regales itself with the supernal delights. The virtuous who are thought to be worthy to be bound up in the bundle of the living are privileged to see the glory of the supernal holy king. Again, they're privileged to see the glory of the supernal holy king. What is God's answer to Moshe when he asked to see his face? You can't look at my back, right? You can't see my face and live. You can't see a certain spiritual truth and still exist. See my back. The rabbis interpret see my back as this is the explanation for, again, of theodicy, why the good suffer and why the wicked prosper. That's what it means to see God's back. To see God's face means something much more elevated than even that. But in this next world, one sees this ultimate glory, and their abode is higher than all of the holy angels. As we said, the angels have no free will, like the animals. Animals merely do their instincts. Angels only fulfill the will of God. Humans have the choice between the two. And we see that humans ultimately have the potential in the heavens to be higher than the angels, because they achieved a certain height based on their free will. And this passage of the Zohar concludes, in the same way as the soul has to be clothed in a bodily garment in order to exist in this world, so is she given an ethereal supernal garment wherewith to exist in the other world and to be enabled to gaze at the effulgence of the life radiating from that land of the living. So the answer the Zohar gives is, no, you cannot merely be in a spiritual state, because a spiritual state has no satisfaction or value if there's not some type of embodiment. And no, you can't exist in a physical state, because that's only a product of that previous world you came from, this world. So it says there's an ethereal supernal garment, which is to say, there is a different type of body in the next world, not just the soul and not just the body, but a new type of body that exists in the next world, which only leaves room for a great imagination. I don't know what you're going to be dreaming about tonight. I'm going to be thinking about this body. Actually, one midrash says, when we do Havdalah, and we hold our Havdalah, and we hold our fingers up to the candlelight, looking at our nails. There's many explanations I love of this. I have like 6 or 7 I like, but the one I want to share tonight is this idea that the midrash says that in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, this might sound gross or exciting, probably gross, their whole bodies were fingernails. Their whole body was an external coating to their body. They were basically protected, and we were given this as a remnant, a reminder of what the Garden of Eden was, that we once had this type of, I don't know, this, I don't know what you call it, what the substance, what would you call the substance?
It's hair.
It's hair?
This is actually hair. It's the same particle, it's just like hair.
Well, so interesting. It is, so I don't know anything about that. That's interesting. But it is similar to hair. That's the only 2 external parts of our body that are dead. I mean, of course, if you push your skin off, the skin is dead. But the nail and hair are dead. And that's why Jewish law says when you get a haircut, you cut your nails, you should wash your hands. Because it's an encounter with death, ultimately. And so we wash our hands after that. But ultimately, that's one imagination of this ethereal supernal garment. This notion that this nail is this sort of body. And in Garden of Eden, that's why they were naked. They sinned, they were naked, they lost the nail. The nail was gone, and now they just had skin. And the skin is considered naked. Actually, it's interesting. The notion of circumcision as nakedness has an interesting history as well. I want to say it properly, and I can't at the moment. So if you're into, I'll say it after. I'll say it after. But there's an interesting Greek Jewish dialogue around this notion of nakedness and what it means to be naked. Okay, this last text I want to bring for tonight is about the Ibor. The Ibor is, how do you say fetus in Hebrew? The word is ubar. Ubar is a fetus. Ibor is a notion of pregnancy. So this is dealing with the pregnancy of the soul. And Gershon Shalom, who again was the greatest scholar of Jewish mysticism of the 20th century, he was at Hebrew University, he talks about this notion of Ibor, which is found in the Zohar. Here's what he says. This really throws your mind, through loops. Not all migrating souls enter the new body at the moment of conception or of birth sometimes. At special moments during the course of his life, a person receives a second soul that is, so to speak, impregnated within his own soul. Right? Now, we already know there's a notion of neshama yetera, right? Neshama yesera. This idea that on Shabbos we get a second soul. And that's part of this, what we're trying to do is arouse this second soul into existence. And then it fades away at Havdalah. That's why we get sad. We get sad because we feel that loss of that soul. And in the most crude sense, although I don't want to put it down, the notion is that we feed that soul. That's why we're supposed to eat more on Shabbos. And you don't gain extra pounds, I'm told, if you eat more on Shabbos. But there's this second soul that we have on Shabbos. But here it says that we impregnate our own soul with another soul. And then it goes on, this additional soul is not linked to his psychophysical organism from birth, and nor does it partake in its development, but it can accompany him until his death or may leave him earlier. According to the Zohar, the souls of certain pious figures in the Bible were impregnated with the deceased souls of other righteous men from the past at decisive moments in their lives. Hence, the soul of Judah entered that of Boa, while those of Aaron's sons, Nadav and Avihu, entered that of Phinehas. And so here we see this notion that souls are deeply interconnected. And one of the places this becomes sort of troubling, or maybe exciting, I don't know, is that there was only 3 million souls at Sinai. And the idea is that there's actually only 3 million Jewish souls in the world. Now, what's the problem? There's about 12 or 13 or 14 or whatever million, based on whatever census you follow, Jews in the world today. And so the argument there is that we are all actually only a partial soul. And we actually truly do have soulmates in the world who are the other part of our own soul. Because Jewish souls only came into existence at Sinai, and there were only 3 million there. And since then, it's called Shavirat HaKelim, the breaking of the vessels. This is part of Moshe breaking the second tablets, the first tablets, and it shatters. And so too, all the spiritual sparks in the world shattered. And what we call in the Lurianic Kabbalah, meaning Isaac Luria of Sfat, we call Tikkun. Right? Tikkun Olam. Right? Today, Tikkun Olam means get a shovel and let's go dig up for a plant, right? But Tikkun Olam in the mystics meant we're repairing the spiritual sparks in the world of the souls that have been fragmented into different bodies. So this notion is that there's only 3 million Jewish souls, and they've become very scattered in the world, and our work is to reunite those spiritual sparks in the world. Okay. So to conclude, let me just say one thing in the Mesilas Yesharim, in this work of Musar, and then I'll conclude, which is that he says ultimately that what we should do is that ultimately we are judged based upon how merciful we are. That there are always people who wrong us in our lives, and the human tendency is to hold a grudge against them or to dismiss them or punish them or whatever the case is. And it says, when we reach the level when we are merciful to those who have wronged us, and we ultimately act benevolently towards all people, that is sort of the secret password to God's mercy. That whether we live the perfect lives or not, that ultimately, once we return to the path of mercy, and that's what we're doing in the High Holidays, we're saying these 13 attributes of mercy over and over again, trying to cultivate in us, I don't live perfect, but I want to be merciful, I want to just be kind to all those who are suffering, even those who have wronged me, and that too, God will say, okay, if the world operated by strict judgment, nobody would have a place in this next world, but because you do this miraculous thing called mercy, I too will do it. And so to conclude tonight, I wanted to say three things. Firstly, we don't know anything, right? There is this great mystery about what will happen next, and Judaism doesn't embrace so much. I'm not saying it rejects, but all these sort of popular books and TV shows out now that talk about people dying and coming back and knowing what the next world is. I'm not saying it rejects that or puts it down as much as it says we're not so obsessed with that. And so we don't really know anything, but the texts, some believe these texts, which we've explored over the last 3 sessions, and there's hundreds more, that these are, some believe merely the creativity and the imagination of the rabbinic mind, but traditionalists believe that this is a part of our great oral tradition that was a part of revelation of a thing that we strive for. So that's the first thing I want to say. We don't know anything, but we have a lot of really interesting ideas that give a lot of food for thought. Secondly, is that all we can do, and this is an obvious point we already came in with, is live with integrity to our spiritual and ethical values. That we should do the hard work of assessing what is true and what is good, and then we should condition ourselves and push ourselves every day of our lives to live closer to that reality of what we ultimately believe is true and good. Perhaps the most tragic life, I think Plato said something like, the good life is the examined life. But the most tragic life is where one has never for themselves figured out for themselves what they believe to be true and what they believe to be good, or never taken the active steps to condition their lives to be in sync with that. One believes X, Y, and Z is true, but they don't live in accordance with that. Or one actually never even asked the question, what do I believe? Either because they're radical relativists and believe nothing is true, or because they're radical pluralists and believe everything is true, or they just don't like to think much about ideas. So that would be kind of tragic. So that's the second thing I want to say, is that that's what all we can really do, is do our best to figure out what is true and good, and live our lives in accordance with that. And lastly, that Olam Haba, the Jewish afterlife, is very significant in Jewish tradition, but the essence, again, really is to focus here on this world. That the value of this afterlife really serves as a reminder for us of how much is at stake. Not just how much is at stake for our own sense of punishment or reward, but how much is at stake in this short life of what it means to get it right versus get it wrong, in a sense. And that Olam Haba is a tool or a vehicle or a resource to help us to reflect upon our spiritual existence and what the good life ultimately can be. And more than speculation on what will be next, as interesting as that is, the work should be, how am I going to achieve the good life here? With that, if someone will hit our button there, and we'll take a couple of concluding thoughts and questions.